Have you ever wondered what you would do if in the dead of night, the wild itself came knocking on your door, begging for help? In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, where temperatures fall to 45 degrees Celsius and survival is reserved only for the fiercest, a man faced a choice that would defy every law of nature. A choice that would alter not only his destiny, but the fate of a wild creature desperately clinging to life. This isn't just another story about wildlife. This is a true emotional animal rescue story that blurs the lines between instinct and compassion, between fear and courage. It began on a night when the wind howled like spirits through the pines, and the snow fell sideways in a blinding whiteout. Deep in the forest, isolated from the rest of the world, stood a solitary cabin. Inside, Mike, an ex-wildlife photographer turned recluse, sat near a dying fire, listening to the moaning storm outside. He had chosen this life after tragedy struck years ago, abandoning the noise of the city for the silence of the snow. But that night, the silence was shattered. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks. A faint sound, low, dragging, almost like a wounded breath. Then it came again, closer, a crunching on the porch. Not the deliberate stomp of a moose or the skitter of a fox. No, this was different. Slower, heavier, desperate. Mike grabbed his flashlight, heart racing. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just a passing animal. As he approached the door, the handle was ice cold, the hinges stiff from frost. He hesitated, years of knowledge about Alaskan predators flashing through his mind. Opening a door in these conditions could mean death, but he opened it anyway. And there, curled against the edge of the cabin, half buried in snow, was a bear cub, no more than a few months old. Its fur was soaked and frozen, its small body trembling violently. One eye was swollen shut, its breathing shallow, visible in short misty puffs against the Arctic air. For a moment, time froze. Mike stood in the doorway, stunned. His instincts screamed, "Close the door, walk away." Every survival manual he'd ever read warned against getting involved, but something rooted him there, something older than reason. The bear cub lifted its head just slightly, and their eyes met. And in that moment, it wasn't a wild animal lying at his feet. It was a soul on the edge of life, a plea without words, a fragile heartbeat buried in the snow, asking for a chance. Mike knelt slowly, lowering the flashlight. The cub didn't move. No growl, no fear, just exhaustion. With trembling hands, he wrapped his old wool coat around the little body and lifted it. Barely a few kilograms of fur and bone. He could feel its heartbeat thudding weakly against his chest. Back inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to pulse with urgency. Mike laid the cub on a blanket, wrapped it in towels, and prepared warm water bottles. Hours passed. He didn't sleep. He just watched, adjusting the fire, adjusting the cub's body, whispering to it without knowing why. All through the night, the storm screamed. But inside that cabin, something else stirred. A quiet defiance, a wild, unspoken bond beginning to form. This wasn't just survival, this was connection. He had no idea if the cub would make it until morning. No idea what he would do if it did. But something in him had already shifted. The grief he carried like ice in his bones began to melt, just a little, just enough to let something in. Outside, the wind continued to roar, but Mike didn't hear it anymore. Because lying just a few feet away was a creature born to fear humans, now clinging to one for warmth. And the man who had spent years trying to feel nothing, now felt everything. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the beginning of a story the world would never forget. Before that frozen night in Alaska, before the bear cub and the impossible bond, Mike was someone else entirely. Years earlier, Mike Patterson had been a celebrated wildlife photographer, known for capturing breathtaking images of bears, wolves, and eagles in their rawest, most primal states. His work had appeared in national magazines, nature documentaries, and on gallery walls around the world. But fame didn't shield him from fate. It happened during what was supposed to be a dream trip to Denali National Park. Mike and his wife Sarah were hiking deep into the backcountry when an avalanche, triggered by a freak weather shift, came roaring down the mountainside. Sarah didn't survive. From that day forward, everything changed. Mike gave up the camera, gave up his home, gave up almost everything, except his need for silence. He moved into the Alaskan wild alone, seeking not peace but numbness. He found an abandoned trapper's cabin near the edge of a frozen valley and rebuilt it with his own hands. No internet, no neighbors, just wind, snow, and the occasional howl of something watching from the trees. In the beginning, people thought he was running away, but the truth was far more painful. He was running inward, hoping the wilderness would strip everything unnecessary, until there was nothing left but breath, cold, and maybe healing, or oblivion. He didn't really care which. For nearly 5 years, Mike lived off the land. He hunted responsibly, tracked game, tended a greenhouse for vegetables in the summer, wrote journals he never read. Nights were long, bitter, and dark. Winters were brutal. But for Mike, it was all easier than feeling. That was until a Mac arrived. The night the cub collapsed on his porch, something ancient inside Mike reawakened. He didn't fully understand it then. He just knew this. Something small, fragile, and wild had chosen to trust him, and that felt sacred. He remembered Sarah's voice, from a recording he'd listened to only once after her death. She had said, "When you see something helpless, you help. That's who you are, Mike." He had buried that part of himself for years, but Amak unearthed it. As the cub lay wrapped in blankets, its breathing shallow but steady, Mike allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in years. Purpose. A reason to act. A chance to save something he couldn't before. That night stretched into morning. Mike fed the cub drops of warm goat's milk with a cloth. He rubbed its fur dry with his old flannel shirt, and he whispered its new name, Amak. It meant the soul in the language of the Inuit people. He'd once photographed a tribal elder who spoke of bears not just as animals, but as relatives, spirits in flesh, protectors, teachers, and now one had come to him, in need. If you've ever believed that some stories choose us, and not the other way around, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe now and join us on this emotional journey. There's so much more ahead. Over the next few days, the bond between man and cub deepened. Mike didn't speak much, but Amak didn't need words. He watched. He listened. He followed. As strength returned to his limbs, the cub began exploring the cabin. Clumsy steps, curious eyes, nuzzling Mike's boots for warmth. Mike made a small bed from pine branches and wool near the fire. He crushed berries and boiled grains to create soft meals. He adjusted the space so Amak could safely explore indoors and blocked the chimney after the cub climbed halfway up one day. He laughed for the first time in years. That laughter startled him more than the cub ever could. But Mike also knew this couldn't last forever. Bears grow. Nature calls. Wildness doesn't vanish. It waits. It pulses beneath the surface. Still, for those few weeks, man and animal lived in a kind of harmony that no law, no textbook, no survival manual could ever explain. It was instinctual, intuitive, impossible. And it was healing. Mike kept a journal again, for the first time since Sarah's death. This time not about loss, but about growth, about Amak's progress, about the way his heart, once frozen by grief, was thawing day by day, paw by paw. He wrote, "I didn't save him. He saved me from disappearing." He didn't know that Amak would one day walk away. Didn't know whether their paths would ever cross again. But none of that mattered yet. Because right now, a man who once gave up on the world had found a reason to build something again, to trust something again, to love something again. And somewhere in the vast, frozen Alaskan silence, the storm was preparing to return. But this time, it wouldn't be coming alone. In the days that followed, the cabin changed. It wasn't just the smell of boiled roots or dried fish hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't just the scattered fur, the overturned pots, or the claw marks etched into the wooden floor. It was something in the air. A pulse of life Mike hadn't felt in years. Amak was growing stronger, and with each sunrise, more curious. At first, he'd stay near the fire, nestled into the wool and pine bed Mike had made. But soon he started exploring. He'd sniff every corner, knock over boots, paw through old photography equipment, and once even tried to climb into the cupboard in search of honey, an instinct that made Mike laugh so hard he cried. The first time Amak barked, a rough, high-pitched sound of surprise, it echoed in the small cabin like a song, a burst of playfulness in a space that hadn't known joy for so long. Mike froze, startled by the emotion that welled up inside him. He hadn't heard that kind of noise since Sarah used to hum while cooking, and now this little wild being had taken up space in his soul like sunlight cracking through frost. Days turned into weeks. Amak learned to follow Mike outside. At first on a leash Mike fashioned from rope and leather, then free, but always close. He would tumble through the deep snow, paw at Mike's coat, and collapse into his arms when tired. The two would hike short distances, always returning before the night swallowed the land. Mike taught Amak things, not like a trainer teaches tricks, but like a parent teaches survival. How to find berries beneath the ice, how to fish from a hole in the river, how to listen to the wind and read the rhythm of the trees. And Amak taught Mike things too, how to live again, how to find joy in the ordinary, how to open a heart that had forgotten how to feel anything but grief. Mike started taking photographs again, not for magazines, not for awards, but for memory. Every frame captured Amak in motion, leaping through drifts, staring into the forest, sleeping under the stars. One photo in particular, he printed and hung above the fireplace. Amak standing on his hind legs in the doorway, eyes wide with curiosity, like a sentinel watching over the man who saved him. But the truth was undeniable. Amak was no longer a cub. He was bigger now, stronger. His paws thudded against the cabin floor. His breath steamed the windows. And sometimes, just for a second, Mike saw the bear inside him. The raw power, the instinct to roam, the wildness rising. It didn't scare him. It broke him. Because with every inch Amak grew, Mike knew he was losing time. Losing this moment. Losing the impossible miracle that had wandered into his life. Still, he held on. One evening, a storm rolled in fast. Thunderous winds, needle-sharp snow. Mike moved Amak indoors early, but something felt off. The bear was pacing, uneasy. He growled low when the wind howled too loud. Mike sat beside him, resting a hand on his thickened back. Then, out of nowhere, a howl split the sky. A wolf. Amak stiffened. Mike's heart raced. Before he could react, Amak bolted, out the door, into the blizzard. No leash, no barrier, just instinct and snow. Mike screamed his name, ran into the storm, blind and desperate. But before the panic could consume him, a dark shape emerged from the white. Amak. Chasing the wind, chasing the danger, chasing the call of the wild. But he stopped, right at the tree line, turned back, looked at Mike, and came home. It was the moment Mike realized something no one had ever said out loud. This bond shouldn't exist. Not like this. Not forever. It was beautiful, but it was borrowed time. Mike didn't sleep that night. While Amak curled by the fire, still panting from the adrenaline, Mike stared at the ceiling, his mind racing through every memory of the past weeks. Every laugh, every quiet glance, every heartbeat that echoed louder than the storm outside. He had always known this was temporary, but knowing and accepting are not the same. By morning the sun returned, crisp and blinding. The trees stood tall and silent, heavy with snow. Mike made tea, fed Amak, then sat on the cabin steps for a long time watching the sky. There were rules about wildlife, federal laws, ethical boundaries, but none of those rules had crossed his mind when he found that cub on his porch, freezing and alone. He didn't think about regulations. He thought about survival, about doing what was right in the moment. Now, that moment was over. Amak was a bear, a wild animal, one that couldn't live in a cabin, couldn't follow a man forever, couldn't rely on human hands to feed him. He needed space, instinct, a pack of his own, something deeper than even love could give him. Mike spent the day gathering supplies. He packed dried meat, berries, clean water, blankets. Then, with trembling hands, he wrote a letter. Not for anyone in particular, just for himself. a letter to mark the day he would say goodbye. He contacted the reserve via satellite radio. A protected habitat nearly 300 kilometers away agreed to receive Amak. No cages, no sedation. They understood the nature of the bond, the story, the risk. The next morning, Mike built a sled and harnessed it to his snowmobile. He reinforced the back for Amak, who trusted him enough to climb aboard without hesitation. The cub, now nearly adolescent, sat with calm eyes and a tilted head, unaware of the journey ahead. The drive took 2 days, through icy valleys and over frozen rivers. They stopped only to rest, eat, and sleep under a sky filled with stars so close it felt like they might fall. Amak stayed close. Always close. Mike didn't speak much. What could he say? On the second night, as they neared the entrance to the wildlife corridor, Mike built a fire and sat across from Amak. The bear stared at him, then slowly moved forward, resting his large head on Mike's knee. The weight of it was immense, real, warm. Mike closed his eyes, memorizing everything. The next morning, he let go. The ranger opened the gate. The forest inside stretched endlessly, wild and untouched. Mike walked Amak to the edge. The bear hesitated, then looked back. Their eyes met one last time. There was no roar, no sound, just breath. Amak stepped forward into the trees, disappearing behind the birch and pine. And just like that, the cabin felt 1,000 miles away. The silence returned, colder than before. Mike stood there long after the gate closed, staring at the trail. When he finally turned to leave, he didn't cry, but something inside him did. Back at the cabin, the space felt too large, too quiet. He moved slowly, cleaning, removing bowls, folding the blanket near the fire. The photograph above the fireplace remained, untouched. Amak, standing tall, watching. Winter passed slowly. Mike walked the same paths alone, fished alone, read by the fire, often dozing off into dreams where snowflakes became paw prints and silence became growls. He wrote letters again, this time to Sarah. He told her about Amak, about how something wild reminded him what it meant to care again, to hope. And even though he knew it was the right thing, he couldn't help but wonder, did Amak ever think about him too? Did animals remember? Did they feel something close to love? He didn't know. But the wilderness has a way of answering in its own time. It was early spring when the first signs appeared. Tracks, wide, heavy, deliberate, crossed just outside the tree line near Mike's cabin. At first he thought they belonged to a wandering male, maybe a grizzly searching early for food. But the pattern was familiar. Too familiar. There was something in the stride, the way the paw pressed into the half-thawed soil. Then came the sound. A low, steady exhale just before sunrise. Not a growl, not a warning. A breath. Close. Measured. As if announcing presence without demanding attention. Mike stepped onto the porch, heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with mist, and the forest beyond looked like it was holding its breath. He scanned the shadows. The wind moved gently through the pines, and then he saw it. A shape, massive and still, stood just beyond the first row of trees. The rising light caught its eyes, dark, steady, knowing. Not afraid, not lost. Watching. Amak. Mike didn't speak. He couldn't. His breath caught in his throat as the bear stepped forward, slow and calm. There was no rush, no threat, just a presence. Behind him, another shape moved. A smaller bear, and then another. Cubs. A female followed close, cautious but unthreatening. Amak turned to her, then back to Mike. It was impossible. Years had passed. Wild instincts should have taken over. Memories should have faded. But Amak remembered. Not just the scent. Not just the voice. He remembered him. The bear stopped just 10 feet away. He lowered his head slightly. A movement so subtle, so human-like, it sent a chill through Mike's entire body. Then slowly, deliberately, he sat. They stayed like that for what felt like a lifetime. Man and bear, both older, both changed. The cub sniffed the air, curious. The female remained back, her eyes never leaving Amak. But the old bond didn't need explaining. It was written in the silence between them, in the stillness of the forest, in the way Amak didn't move any closer, but didn't walk away. Mike stepped off the porch, boots crunching gently on the damp earth. He moved slowly, cautiously, until they were barely a few feet apart. He didn't reach out. He didn't dare. Instead, he lowered himself into a seated position on the ground, mirroring Amak. And Amak closed his eyes. For one breath. Maybe two. It wasn't a display. It wasn't a performance. It was trust. Then the bear stood, looked at his family, and turned. With the same slow, calm movement, he led them back into the forest, disappearing without sound. Mike remained on the ground long after they were gone. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from something deeper, a kind of awe that left no room for words. Later that day, he checked the motion-triggered cameras he'd set up weeks before. The footage was clear, crisp, a full record of the moment. The internet would explode when he shared it, but that wasn't why he saved it. He saved it because some stories are too big for memory alone. That night, Mike sat by the fire again. The same fire he'd once built for a frozen cub who had no reason to trust a man. He looked at the photograph above the mantel. Amak, young and curious, standing in the doorway. Now, he was a father. Now, he was free. And still, somehow, he came back. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time itself was reluctant to carry him too far from what had just happened. Mike kept replaying it in his mind. The way Amak had looked at him, the weight of that silence, the momentary surrender between two creatures who had shared something the world would never fully understand. He didn't go into town. He didn't call anyone. He didn't speak of it, not at first. He needed to hold it close, let it settle, let it become real in his own bones before offering it to anyone else. When he finally uploaded the footage, it wasn't with captions or dramatic music, just raw clips. The cold, crisp visuals of a bear returning with his family to visit the man who once saved him. Within hours, the video spread across platforms like wildfire. People from all over the world began to comment. Scientists, animal lovers, skeptics, poets. They used words like unprecedented, unbelievable, spiritual. But Mike didn't care about the headlines. He read the comments anyway. People spoke about their own losses, about loved ones they missed, about moments in nature that made them feel something they couldn't explain. There were thousands of messages. Some called it a miracle. Others called it memory. A few just said, "Thank you." Mike responded to none, but he read every one. Outside, the forest moved on. The snow melted. Rivers ran faster. Birds returned to the sky. Sometimes, when the nights were especially clear, he would sit outside with a cup of strong tea, listening, hoping. But he knew Amak wouldn't come back like that again. He didn't have to. That final visit wasn't about reunion. It was acknowledgement. A way of saying, "I remember." Mike resumed his days with a quiet steadiness. He started taking photographs again, not for galleries or profit, but because he wanted to remember everything. The way the moss grew on the north side of the pines, the early blooms that pushed through frost, the curve of a cloud just before a snow squall. He kept a journal, not just for Amak, but for every small wonder that tried to go unnoticed. Sometimes, the cubs from neighboring ranges would wander close. Not Amak's, not yet, but young bears learning the territory, sniffing the air, testing boundaries. Mike never interfered. He would watch from a distance, heart steady, eyes soft. He began building a trail behind his cabin, carefully stacking stones and clearing brush as if mapping the memories. At the trailhead, he placed a marker, a single carved word, Amak. Visitors would come eventually. The story had drawn attention, but Mike wasn't afraid of that anymore. He knew the real story didn't live on a screen. It lived in the silence between steps, in the glance of an animal that once needed saving, in the way trust can echo louder than sound. He didn't know what would come next, but he no longer feared the unknown. Because somewhere out there in the vast, wild distance walked a bear with eyes like winter and a memory like fire. A bear that once slept beside a man, shared a fire, and returned, not because he had to, but because he chose to. One evening, as golden light filtered through the trees and painted the edges of the cabin in warmth, Mike sat on his porch with his journal in hand. The wind was calm, the air carried a scent of pine and melting snow. A bluebird landed on the railing just a few feet from him, tilting its head as if curious. He watched it in silence, the quiet rhythm of the forest settling into his chest like a lullaby. He opened the journal and wrote one sentence. He came back. It was all he needed to say. There were hundreds of pages behind that one, observations, drawings, questions, memories. But this line felt like a completion, not an end, just a recognition, a thread that had found its way home. In the weeks that followed, Mike built a small bench at the edge of the clearing where a Mac had stood. He didn't label it or fence it in. It was just there, a place to sit and remember, to feel the air, to be still. Sometimes he'd bring a thermos of coffee and sit for an hour. Other times he wouldn't stay long. But the bench remained, untouched, waiting for whoever might need it. People began to arrive, cautiously at first. Locals, hikers, even a documentary team. They wanted to walk the trail, to ask questions, to feel what Mike had felt. Some brought flowers. Others brought silence. One woman simply sat on the bench and cried. She didn't explain why, and Mike didn't ask. He watched it all with a quiet kind of gratitude. This story that began in a storm had reached so many, not because it was dramatic or impossible, but because it was true, because something deep within everyone longs to believe in connection. In return, in memory that defies instinct. One evening, a child visiting with his parents asked Mike if the bear would ever come back again. Mike smiled gently and looked out at the trees. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't need him to." The boy nodded, accepting the answer without needing more. Later that night, as the stars emerged one by one, Mike sat by the fire, a familiar rhythm in his hands as he sharpened a stick, not for need, just for the motion. He thought about how much had changed since that first storm, how a frozen creature had wandered into his life not as a threat, but as a beginning, how love, real love, sometimes looks like letting go, like staying behind while someone else walks forward. He closed his eyes and listened. The wind was moving through the treetops, slow and steady. The earth was quiet beneath it. Somewhere, far off, a distant howl broke through the night. Wolf, maybe, or something older. Mike didn't move. He smiled, and the fire burned on. In the months that followed, the visits continued, not from Amak, but from people. Those who had seen the video, read the articles, or simply heard whispers of a man and a bear in the frozen north. Some brought offerings, stones carved with messages, drawings of bears made by children, handwritten letters folded with care. They left them near the marker where the trail began, treating it like a sacred place. Mike never asked for any of it. But he didn't turn them away either. He greeted those who came with kindness, offered tea, shared bits of his story when asked. But mostly he listened. The visitors spoke more about themselves than the bear, about pain they hadn't voiced before, about people they had lost or fears they carried. Somehow, the story of a wild animal returning had given them the words they hadn't found elsewhere. One morning, Mike found a laminated note tied gently to the marker. It read, "I came here hoping to feel something again. I think I did. Thank you." He held the note for a while, folded it slowly, and placed it in his journal. Life returned to its own pace. The seasons shifted. The forest bloomed, then burned with color, then fell silent under new snow. Mike moved with it, splitting wood, repairing the roof, tending the greenhouse. The cabin, once a place of escape, had become something else. A waypoint. A place where something had been healed, and where others now came to begin their own healing. At night, when the fire was low and the forest dark, he would sometimes take out the photograph of Amak. Not the one by the fireplace, the one he kept tucked away in the back of a drawer. It showed Amak just days before their separation, standing with one paw resting gently on the threshold, half in the cabin, half in the wild. Eyes filled with trust. No fear, no confusion, just quiet understanding. Mike studied that image more than any he had ever taken, because it didn't just capture a moment, it captured everything unsaid, every emotion too big for words, every sacrifice that love sometimes demands. One early winter morning, a fresh layer of snow blanketed the forest. The light was soft and golden. The world hushed. Mike stepped outside and found new tracks near the edge of the trees. Not fresh, but recent. Wide, heavy, deliberate, not wandering. He followed them for a few meters, heart slow, eyes scanning the distance. No figure appeared. No sound broke the stillness, but the tracks were enough. He knelt beside them, pressing his gloved hand gently into the impression. The size was familiar. The spacing. The direction. A path that didn't need to circle back to be complete. He stood and looked out at the vast white beyond the trees, the cold brushing against his face like breath. And for a long time he simply stood there, the tracks leading away from him into the forest, into the unknown. He didn't follow. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, snow crunching beneath his boots. Inside, the fire waited. So did the bench, the trail, the visitors who might still come, the stories yet to be shared. And somewhere out there, in the quiet wild, a bear lived free, carrying with him a memory, just as a man did here. Not held by chains or walls, but by something far stronger. Choice, trust, a bond that time could not erase. The days grew shorter. Frost clung to the windows each morning, forming delicate patterns like messages from the wild itself. Inside the cabin, the fire became more than warmth, it became rhythm. It marked the passage of time, the beating heart of a life rebuilt from silence. Mike moved through each day with quiet purpose. He had no grand plans, no destination beyond what was right in front of him. A kettle boiling, a chair beside the window, a letter from someone he'd never met, sharing how the story of a bear had reached them in a moment of darkness. He answered some of them now, not all, just the ones that asked, gently, to be seen. One letter arrived in a simple envelope. No return address, no stamp. It was left at the trail marker. Inside, a single sentence. "Do you think he knows you remember too?" Mike held the paper for a long time before placing it beside the journal. He didn't write a reply, but he whispered into the fire that night, as if the flames might carry the words into the trees. "I do." As the snow deepened, visitors became fewer. The trail froze over, and silence returned, soft and complete. But Mike didn't feel alone. Not anymore. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to remember. Space to carry something without the need to hold it too tightly. He still looked out across the tree line sometimes. Not in expectation, but in gratitude. That place where Amak had stood, where those eyes met his, had become a part of him. Not a place to revisit, but a place that lived inside him now. Each morning he lit the fire, sipped strong coffee, and watched the slow dance of light filtering through the snow-covered branches. He read letters from strangers who felt less alone because a bear once returned. He listened to the forest breathe. He added to his journal, less about what happened, more about what remained. And slowly, quietly, without ceremony, he began to build again. Not walls, not fences, but stories. Stories of kindness, of survival, of the wild things that choose sometimes to trust us. Stories not of endings, but of continuations. And in every word he wrote, in every memory he shared, Amak walked beside him. Not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as proof that what is real never truly leaves. One morning, long after the last visitor had come and gone, Mike found himself standing at the edge of the forest trail once more. The air was still, the sky a deep gray that hinted at another snowstorm approaching. He held no camera, no notebook, nothing to record with, only his breath and his memory. He stepped forward slowly, letting his boots break through the thin crust of ice on the path. The forest welcomed him like an old friend, familiar, unchanging in its silence. The trees stretched high above, bare and strong, their branches etched against the sky. He walked without urgency, guided not by destination but by something quieter, something settled. Along the path he saw remnants left by those who had come before, stones arranged in small circles, carvings in tree bark, strands of red ribbon tied loosely to low branches. Each one a sign that someone else had felt it too, this invisible thread that bound a man and a bear across time and instinct. At the clearing he stopped. The bench was still there, half covered in snow. He brushed it off and sat, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the trees. No shape appeared. No sound broke the stillness, but he didn't expect it to. It wasn't about seeing a mock again. It was about honoring the space where something unexplainable had once occurred. He closed his eyes. There was a moment, brief and light, where the wind shifted and carried with it the faintest scent of fir, earth, and pine. A scent he knew. It passed quickly, barely noticeable, but it was enough. He smiled. The bear had moved on, lived, protected, raised, and somewhere in that distant expanse of wilderness he walked among his own, carrying within him the memory of warmth and shelter, of a man who once reached out in a storm and chose compassion. Mike stood and turned back down the trail. Snow began to fall gently, brushing his shoulders, catching in his hair. Each step home felt light, like walking inside a story already written, carried now not in pages but in breath, in the quiet of the trees, in the fire that would still be burning when he returned. The cabin waited with its warmth. The journal remained open on the table, and outside, beneath the white sky and sleeping pines, the world kept remembering. That evening, Mike placed another log on the fire and sat in the worn armchair across from the flames. The light flickered across the walls, dancing on old photographs, wooden shelves, and the dusty boots near the door. A gentle crackle filled the room, the only sound besides the wind brushing softly against the windows. He opened the journal once more, flipping past the early pages. Sketches of a mock as a cub, scattered thoughts scribbled during sleepless nights, fragments of grief and wonder. He stopped on a blank page near the end, held the pen loosely, and waited. There was no urgency now. No need to recount events or preserve timelines. What remained was presence, memory distilled not into facts, but into feeling. He began to write. I don't know if he will come again. I don't think that matters. What matters is that he lived, and that I was there to witness the moment he chose to return. That is enough. The ink settled into the paper, absorbed slowly, like snow melting into earth. He paused, listening to the fire. Then, without planning it, he kept writing. Some say animals remember only what they need to survive, but I believe they remember what touches them. And when they do, they don't forget. He closed the journal gently and leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The room glowed with that quiet light, the kind that doesn't illuminate everything, just enough. Enough to see, enough to trust. Outside, the snow fell steady. Inside, the past and present lived side by side, not as burden and escape, but as proof that something once broken could become something whole again. He closed his eyes, not in sorrow, but in peace. And somewhere far beyond the fire, in the deep silence of the forest, a great bear walked beneath the trees, free, strong, and remembered. The fire had burned low by the time Mike stirred again. Only glowing embers remained, pulsing softly like a heartbeat in the dark. He stood, stretched, and moved through the cabin, each creak of the floorboards echoing in the quiet. He added another log, coaxing the flames back to life, then poured a bit of water into a kettle and set it above the fire. Steam slowly began to rise. He moved to the window and looked out. The snowfall had thickened, blanketing the clearing in clean white silence. The trail was gone now, buried beneath inches of snow, but Mike could still see it. Every bend, every footprint that had ever passed through it. He placed a hand gently on the cold glass. So much had come and gone since that first night. The storm, the cub, The firelight wrapped around fur and fear and hope, and somehow all of it had settled into a stillness that no longer felt like waiting. He turned away from the window and walked toward the fireplace, kettle whistling softly behind him. From the shelf beside his chair, he retrieved the photograph again, the one he'd only looked at in the quietest hours. He stared at it for a long time, then placed it carefully on the table beside his journal. He didn't need to keep it hidden anymore. The wind picked up, brushing past the cabin with a low hum, as if passing along a message meant only for those who knew how to listen. Mike sat, tea in hand, watching the fire climb again. Shadows shifted across the walls. The warmth returned, and as the night deepened, the silence wrapped itself around him, not as emptiness but as presence, the kind of silence that holds what words cannot, the kind of silence that remembers. The night wore on, and the storm outside thickened, blanketing the forest in a quiet so complete it pressed against the windows like a soft weight. Inside, the cabin remained untouched by time, firelight flickering, steam rising gently from the mug in Mike's hands, the photograph catching the glow like a memory suspended in light. He leaned back into the chair, the cushion familiar beneath him, the scent of pine and smoke woven into the walls like threads of a life he no longer wished to escape. The solitude that had once felt like exile now felt earned, chosen. A shelter built not just from wood, but from truth. He let his eyes close, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Not to escape, but to remember. Somewhere, far beyond the cabin, the trees stood tall, their branches heavy with snow. In the hush of that great stillness, paws moved silently over frozen ground. A trail known by instinct remembered in the body. A presence vast and alive, moving through the wild, not as a visitor, but as part of it. Amak. Perhaps he was watching the same snowfall. Perhaps he was guiding his young through the same shadows where he once stumbled as a cub. Perhaps in some unseen rhythm of the world, their paths still ran side by side, just in different terrain. Mike opened his eyes slowly. The fire had settled again into embers, soft and steady. He didn't move to stoke it. He didn't need to. Its warmth was enough. And in that quiet moment, without sound, without movement, something passed through him. Not a thought, not a memory, just presence. The simple, powerful knowing that what had been real once still was. Morning came gently, its light diffused by the snow still falling, soft and slow. The forest looked untouched, pristine, as if the world had paused to exhale. Inside the cabin, the warmth lingered. The embers in the fireplace still glowed, and the air carried the faint scent of cedar and ash. Mike rose without hurry. His movements were quiet, intentional. He poured fresh water, fed the birds outside with the last of the cracked corn, and stepped back to watch as their tiny shapes fluttered to the railing, undisturbed by his presence. Their wings beat rhythmically, like tiny echoes of life continuing, just as it always had. He put on his coat and stepped outside. The snow muffled every sound, each step sinking slightly into the powder. The cold kissed his face but didn't bite. He followed the edge of the clearing, tracing the invisible line where memory had once crossed into his world. At the trailhead, the marker stood snow-covered, the carved name barely visible beneath the frost. He brushed it clean with one gloved hand, then rested his fingers over the letters. No words came to him. None were needed. The trees stood still. No birds called. No wind stirred the branches. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, weighted with something unseen, something larger than a man or a bear, something that had unfolded between them and remained long after the moment had passed. He turned back, leaving a trail of footsteps behind him. As he approached the cabin, he paused at the door, looking once more out into the forest. He didn't look for movement. He didn't search the distance for a familiar shape. He just stood there, present, rooted, still, and then he stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing the warmth inside. He removed his coat, shook the snow from his boots, and placed another log onto the embers. The fire responded slowly, curling up around the wood like it had been waiting. He stood for a moment listening to the crackle, feeling the heat gather again. The room hadn't changed, yet it carried the weight of everything it had held. Grief, healing, silence, return. And through all of it, one constant. Presence. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken or named. He moved to the table, opened the journal, and added one final line beneath the others. He chose freedom. I chose to remember. The ink dried quickly, the page curling slightly at the corner from the nearby heat. He left the journal open, untouched. Outside, the snow kept falling. No paths remained, no tracks visible. Just the white, soft and vast and endless. But Mike didn't feel lost in it. He felt held by it, like something had been given back to the land. Not taken, returned. He poured another cup of tea and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. They moved with no pattern, no urgency, just steady, alive, and quiet. Like him. He leaned back, rested his hands in his lap, and let the stillness settle. And somewhere beyond the trees and time and distance, the memory of a shared fire, a shared winter, and a single impossible bond remained, untouched, unbroken, true.